Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into one of the great and, well, often really emotional environmental controversies of our time, the comprehensive effort to control biological invasion.
Exactly. We're talking about those exotic species, pests,
The
plants.
ones that, well, we often hear from certain critics either cause wildly exaggerated damage or maybe whose management is just a hopeless, futile battle.
It is an intensely contested area, absolutely, both in science and policy. And our source material today is a critical, really rigorous review by the highly respected invasion biologist, Daniel Simberloff.
Right. The paper is titled Biological Invasions, What's Worth Fighting and What Can Be Won.
That's the one.
So our mission in this deep dive is kind of twofold. First, to assess the true, often subtle scope of the ecological and economic impacts these species are actually having.
Which is often underestimated.
Definitely. And second, and maybe most critically, to look at the rapidly developing technologies for prevention and management. The stuff that suggests this is absolutely a winnable fight, directly countering those pessimists.
Yeah, and Simberloff's paper really frames the entire discussion by acknowledging the two main camps of critics that fuel this controversy. It's helpful to lay those out.
Okay.
So on one side, you have the deniers. These are the folks who outright claim the damage caused by biological invasions is, well, overblown.
They challenge the scope of the problem itself.
Exactly. Suggesting the costs are exaggerated, maybe even comparing it to those who might overstate the impacts of global climate change, for instance.
Okay, that's one camp. What's the other?
And then there's that second, perhaps more pragmatic-sounding group of critics.
Right.
They might concede, okay, the problem is severe.
But we can't win.
Right. They argue that the battle is inherently hopeless. They say, why waste precious time, money, political capital fighting an intractable problem?
When those resources could be saved for maybe more tractable conservation efforts, things we know we can achieve.
Precisely. So our goal here is really to address both of those lines of skepticism. We'll do that by reviewing the hard evidence on the often quite insidious long-term effects of introduced species.
And looking at that rapidly advancing technological toolkit that's now available for managing them.
Exactly.
Right. Let's start with the damage then, the current damage. When most people think about invasive species, I think they usually picture direct kind of population-level impacts. Right?
Yeah, like one species eating another, or maybe one outcompeting the other for territory or resources. That's the usual picture.
Predation, herbivory.
Those are the standard direct impacts: predation, herbivory, direct competition, parasitism, even hybridization. And it is true, those impacts alone already impose staggering costs, ecologically, economically, and for public health globally.
But here's the key point you mentioned, where critics find a foothold.
Yes, major effects are not yet known for the vast majority of established introduced species, and that's a fact we have to acknowledge.
Okay, that does seem like a strong argument for the skeptics, doesn't it? If most introduced species seem innocuous, maybe the whole environmental effort is kind of exaggerated.
Well, that inference is premature. The paper argues pretty strongly that this lack of known damage doesn't mean the damage isn't happening.
It just means we haven't seen it yet. Or measured it.
Exactly. It means the damage is systematically underestimated for really three critical reasons. The first is simply a research deficit.
We just haven't studied enough of them.
Right. Only a small minority of introduced populations have actually been studied in detail. And modern invasion biology, as a formal discipline using systematic methods, it's only about 30 years old.
Relatively young, scientifically speaking.
Very young. So the research history is simply too short to have cataloged everything. It's impossible.
Okay, so that's the study gap. What's the second, more subtle reason the damage might be hidden?
The second reason is that many substantial impacts are subtle. They only become evident through intensive long-term research that's conducted at the ecosystem level.
Not just studying species A versus species B.
Precisely. We've had to move beyond simple prey-predator dynamics to understanding how invaders fundamentally modify the underlying conditions, the soil, the water, the physical structure of an ecosystem.
Okay, we definitely need a clear example of that ecosystem modification idea. Because this sounds like where the subtle long-term damage really becomes apparent.
Okay, a classic, almost paradigmatic example involves nutrient cycling. Specifically, the introduction of the nitrogen-fixing shrub Morellifia
Where was this?
to the young, nutrient-poor volcanic soils of Hawaii. Now, the native soil there naturally lacked nitrogen, and the native plant community was specifically adapted to thrive in those low nitrogen conditions.
And why does that adaptation matter so much, ecologically speaking?
Well, it matters because nutrient scarcity, especially nitrogen scarcity, acts as a massive selective pressure. Native plants evolve specific strategies, things like slow growth, high nutrient retention, basically ways to survive where other, faster-growing competitors just couldn't get a foothold.
They carved out a niche.
Exactly. But then Morellifea comes in. By fixing atmospheric nitrogen, it began rapidly enriching the soil, effectively changing the fundamental chemistry of that environment,
Like adding fertilizer.
just like adding fertilizer.
Huh.
And this enrichment favors fast-growing alien plants that can suddenly outcompete the slow-growing, highly adapted native species. So it's not direct competition in the usual sense.
It's changing the rules of the game.
It's changing the foundational infrastructure the native species rely on, undermining their entire strategy.
Wow. That's a really slow burn kind of change, isn't it? Something you wouldn't necessarily notice until you ran chemical tests years, maybe decades later, well after the invasion was established.
Precisely. And you wouldn't see it just looking at individual plants fighting. Another really clear structural example comes from the Haida Gwaii archipelago in Canada.
Okay.
Now, this ecosystem never evolved alongside large browsing mammals like deer. So when introduced Sitka black-tailed deer arrived, they drastically modified the entire structure of the plant communities,
How so? Just eating everything.
pretty much removing most of the ground cover and palatable vegetation they could reach. This elimination of the understory habitat led to massive secondary changes, cascading effects in the bird and insect communities that relied on that specific native ground cover for food, nesting, shelter, everything.
So it's modifying the food web and the physical architecture of the habitat simultaneously.
Yes. And one final, truly remarkable example related to interrupting nutrient flow. Think about rats on small New Zealand islands.
Okay, rats are a classic invader.
A classic. By preying heavily on nesting seabirds, sometimes nearly eliminating them from an island, the rats effectively cut off the flow of marine-derived nutrients.
You mean like guano and carcasses?
Exactly. Guano, dead birds, eggs, stuff the seabirds brought from the ocean onto the land, enriching the terrestrial ecosystem. Researchers found this sudden lack of nutrients significantly decreased populations of below-ground organisms, soil invertebrates and such.
Okay, that makes sense. Less food from above.
But counterintuitively, the above-ground plant biomass actually increased.
Increased walk.
Likely because the constant burrowing activities of the seabirds, which normally disturbed plant growth and seedling establishment, were eliminated along with the birds. So fewer nutrients below ground, but less disturbance above ground.
That is a really complex chain reaction. It emphasizes that simply removing the invader, the rat in this case, might be necessary, but the system itself has already been fundamentally changed. It won't just snap back.
Absolutely. Which leads us directly to the third and perhaps most crucial reason why future impacts are systematically underestimated. This concept of invasion debt.
Invasion debt, that sounds serious, like a massive financial obligation that hasn't come due yet.
That is the perfect analogy. Yeah. We define invasion debt as the increasing number of harmful impacts that will inevitably arise from species already introduced.
Species already here.
Already here, but which are currently deemed innocuous or maybe just localized. They're essentially ticking time bombs embedded in the environment.
Okay, why the delay? Why don't these harmful species just explode immediately upon arrival?
Time lags. It's a really common phenomenon. Many introduced species survive innocuously, often in small, localized populations, for extended periods, sometimes up to several decades.
And then suddenly, boom!
And then they undergo an abrupt, rapid population increase and widespread dissemination. The surge can be due to various factors, maybe reaching a critical population threshold, adapting genetically to local conditions, or often it's some kind of environmental trigger.
Like a disturbance.
Exactly. For instance, the Australian pine, Casuarina equisetifolia, was present in Florida for 60 years, just kind of hanging out, before it began spreading aggressively.
In 60 years, what happened?
The trigger that opened up available habitat for it, 2 major hurricanes swept through. Cleared space, reduced competition.
Wow. So the latent potential for harm is just sitting there waiting for the right environmental shift or maybe the right genetic mutation to unlock it.
Precisely. And compounding this debt is another phenomenon called ecological inertia.
Ecological inertia, what's that?
This is the effect where catastrophic impacts are delayed simply by the long lifespan of dominant native species. Imagine, say, an introduced deer or an insect that prevents the successful reproduction of a long-lived native tree species.
Oh, like eating all the seedlings.
Yeah, or preventing flowering, something like that. The existing adult trees might look perfectly healthy for decades, maybe even centuries, completely masking the fact that no new saplings are successfully recruiting underneath them.
So the forest looks fine.
It looks fine, but it's reproductively dead. The ecosystem won't visibly crash until those existing dominant trees finally die off from old age, decades or even a century later. This lag means we are accruing a massive, unseen invasion debt right now, which makes immediate action prevention even more urgent.
Okay, if that debt is real and the future impacts are subtle but potentially enormous, the first priority has to be prevention, right? Stop them getting here in the first place.
Absolutely.
So let's look at that first line of defense. Interdiction stopping invaders at the border.
Right. And the sheer scale of the interdiction challenge well, it's nearly overwhelming. Globalized trade and travel are the engine of invasion.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
We are talking about global ship cargo swelling to up to 33 trillion ton-miles annually. That's an almost unimaginable number.
Yeah.
Alongside that, passenger air travel is clocking in around 2 billion passenger trips every single year.
Okay, the volume alone makes 100% inspection basically impossible.
Completely impossible.
What specifically is the main bottleneck then? Is it just the quantity or is it a lack of commitment or resources?
Well, the biggest technical impediment is maintaining a sufficient core of trained personnel. You need inspectors, entomologists, botanists, people who can actually identify potential threats within that massive volume of goods and people.
Even with technology.
Even with advanced technology like detector dogs and X-ray equipment, you simply cannot hire enough salaried inspectors to match the flow. It's physically impossible and economically prohibitive.
So it becomes a political funding issue?
Absolutely. Money for biosecurity always competes with highly visible immediate priorities like national security, healthcare, infrastructure projects. Underfunding interdiction is effectively a slow-motion policy failure, but it rarely makes headlines until something disastrous gets through.
Yet, even deficient efforts must provide some benefit, right? It proves that the investment, even if insufficient, is worthwhile.
They absolutely do. The U.S. interdiction efforts, which Simberloff describes, perhaps bluntly, as woefully deficient compared to the scale of the problem,
Okay.
still intercepted over 725,000 non-native organisms between 1984 and 2000 alone.
Wow, 750,000.
Yeah. And many of those intercepted were species already known to be hugely damaging in other nations. So it proves that even a compromised, underfunded action yields massive benefits by preventing known threats from establishing.
And then on the other end of the commitment spectrum, you have nations that have really invested heavily, setting kind of a gold standard. You mentioned New Zealand earlier.
New Zealand is the prime model, really, for stringent biosecurity controls. It's codified by their Biosecurity Act of 1993. Their entire approach is built on stringency and public awareness.
What does that mean in practice?
It means things like mandatory approval of airports and seaports as designated places of first arrival. All incoming vessels, planes too, must notify authorities well in advance. They're forbidden from unloading certain high-risk cargo without a physical inspector's permission.
So tight control at entry points.
Very tight. Furthermore, they publicly advertise the damage caused by invasions, really trying to build public understanding and support, and they aggressively enforce penalties for violations. It helps create a culture of compliance that most large continental nations, frankly, struggle to replicate.
Okay, but even with world-class interdiction, things inevitably slip through the net. That's where early detection rapid response, or EDRR, comes into play, right? The second line of defense.
Exactly. EDRR is based on a simple principle. Eradication is exponentially easier and cheaper if it's carried out before widespread dissemination. Catch it early.
Makes sense.
It's the critical second line of defense. But the paper highlights that the biggest roadblock here is often not the detection itself,
But the response.
but the failure of the policy response. Early warning is often not followed by a rapid, organized response. And this usually comes down to systemic failures in the policy architecture.
What kind of systemic failures are we talking about? What stops the response even after an alert is sounded?
Usually it's a lack of unified nationwide policy, an absence of formal decision-making mechanisms, who decides to act, who pays, and, crucially, inconsistent or absent emergency funding.
So jurisdictional squabbles and no emergency pot of money.
Pretty much. In the U.S., for instance, we have coordinating bodies and plans like the FICM-NUW plan, that's the Federal Interagency Committee for the Management of Noxious and Exotic Weeds. It's designed to coordinate efforts across agencies.
But
But the plan is often implemented in a piecemeal fashion. It lacks dedicated emergency funding and clear, unified authority across all the relevant jurisdictions, federal, state, local.
and the result.
The result is costly, long-term invasions that could have been stopped. Things like common Krupina in Idaho or Coaster's Curse in Hawaii. These became hugely expensive management problems because early detection wasn't met with an immediate, decisive, coordinated, and fully funded response. The window closed.
So if the political will and resources are often insufficient for enough paid staff to do the detection and response, how do we drastically increase detection efficiency? How do we find these things earlier?
You mobilize the citizens. It's pretty much acknowledged that no nation will ever hire enough salaried staff rangers, biologists, to scout out every single recent invader, especially in remote or less traffic areas. It's just too much ground to cover.
So you need more eyes on the ground.
Exactly. This is why successful EDRR programs like the Invasive Plant Atlas of New England or IPAIN rely heavily on trained citizen volunteers, armchair naturalists, hikers, gardeners.
That's fascinating, turning the educated public into environmental scouts. Does it actually work?
Oh, it works stunningly well, often because of local knowledge and just sheer numbers. Consider aquatic invasions. The eradication of the killer Alga caulerpa taxifolia in California.
I remember hearing about that one. Nasty stuff.
Horrible stuff. It was only possible because an alert recreational diver noticed it in a lagoon down near San Diego. He recognized it from publicity about its disastrous invasion in the Mediterranean.
And reported it immediately.
And notified authorities immediately. That quick report allowed for rapid containment and eventual eradication. On the terrestrial side, look at the Asian longhorn beetle eradication in Chicago.
Another big one.
Huge potential threat. That succeeded after a citizen noticed a strange beetle in his firewood pile, got curious, went online, and immediately linked it to existing reports of the invasion spreading elsewhere. He called it in.
Those are really powerful examples. It shows that the most successful early detections are often these serendipitous moments of citizen vigilance, someone seeing something out of place.
Absolutely. But vigilance isn't enough on its own. It requires infrastructure to act on those reports. Too often, these detected invasions still spread because of piecemeal implementation, lack of resources, or unclear mandates after the detection happens.
It's a response problem again.
The response problem. And again, New Zealand serves as the gold standard here. They have a highly publicized exotic pest and disease hotline. Anyone can call it.
And what happens then?
Trained technicians deal with every single report through a well-established formal set of procedures. This ensures rapid assessment and management action follows detection, regardless of where or when the report comes in. It's coordinated, funded, and decisive.
Okay, let's talk about the E word, eradication. Historically, that word carried a real stigma in conservation circles, didn't it? It was often viewed as futile, prohibitively expensive.
And often causing too much collateral damage, yeah? Because of the massive, often chemical-heavy efforts required in the past.
What cemented that view? Were there particular failures?
Well, yeah. That view was really cemented by notorious, highly publicized failures. Most famously, probably, the 14-year, ultimately failed campaign to eradicate the red imported fire ant across the U.S. Southeast that ended back in the 1970s.
Right, I remember hearing about that. Huge amounts of insecticide used.
Massive amounts. Those kinds of failures, coupled with the growing negative publicity about the environmental impacts of broadcast pesticides, really reinforced the idea that eradication of widespread pests was just a fool's errand. Hopeless.
So is that historical pessimism still justified today? I mean, is eradication inherently hopeless for anything beyond a very small contained area?
Well, the evidence Simberloff presents overwhelmingly shows that the stigma of failure is largely outdated. We have seen significant technological advancements across the board.
How significant?
A recent tally of conservation eradication attempts, actual projects aimed at total removal, shows a success rate of 86% across over 1,100 attempts globally.
Wait, 86%? That seems exceptionally high for such a complex, difficult task.
It is high, and it's a powerful counterargument to the futility claim.
Is that figure skewed, though? Maybe towards, like, tiny, easily managed islands or really simple targets? Does it include major continental efforts or difficult species?
It definitely includes many small-scale successes, yes, which are important building blocks. But the figure also reflects significant technological leaps that allow for much larger-scale operations now, directly challenging those historical limitations.
Okay, give me an example of that scale increase?
Okay, for instance, rat eradications. Historically, these were pretty much restricted to islands of maybe 2,000 hectares or less,
Mm,
just too hard to cover larger areas effectively.
right.
Today, we've seen successful rat eradication on Campbell Island, down near New Zealand. That's 11,000 hectares. Much, much larger.
That's a huge jump in scale, 5 times bigger. What about larger, more mobile targets like feral goats? They can be incredibly destructive on islands.
Goats were successfully eradicated from Santiago Island in the Galapagos, which is a massive 58,000 hectares.
58,000.
This success was largely due to the refinement of the Judas goat technique. You might have heard of it.
Vaguely. You release a tagged goat to find the others.
That was the old way, yeah. Release a sterilized goat with a radio collar to locate the herd. The new, improved method uses much better satellite tracking technology, GPS collars, and also highly refined knowledge of goat social dynamics and behavior.
So you understand how they move and group.
Exactly. Allowing teams to track and then systematically eliminate the entire herd much more efficiently, even in really remote, difficult terrain. It's smarter targeting.
So it's not just about more brute force, it's about technology making the effort more surgical and much more effective.
Precisely. And the most massive successes, the ones that really prove feasibility when commitment is there, often come from public health and agriculture.
Mm.
They demonstrate that when resources and political will are fully committed, eradication is possible, even on a continental or global scale.
Like,
Well, globally, we've seen smallpox and rinderpest completely eradicated, huge undertakings. Regionally, the melon fly, a major agricultural pest, was eradicated from the entire Ryukyu archipelago in Japan, including large populated islands like Okinawa.
that's impressive. But what about the truly difficult targets for conservation, like invasive plants with those massive, persistent soil seed banks, or aquatic species that disperse rapidly and are just incredibly hard to detect?
Right. Plants are definitely difficult, precisely because of those persistent soil seed banks. Seeds can remain viable for decades. Some critics argue that eradication of widespread plants was almost impossible because of this.
But we have success stories.
We do. Success stories that refute this pessimism. Sandbur, an invasive grass, was eradicated from Laisna Island in the Hawaiian archipelago. It required a really sustained effort of hand weeding and careful herbicide application over years until the seed bank was finally exhausted.
Persistence pays off.
It does. And even more impressively, consider the parasitic plant witchweed. It infested over 160,000 hectares across North and South Carolina, devastating crops.
Wow, 160,000 hectares.
Huge area. But after a dedicated 50-year campaign involving multiple agencies and landowners,
50 years.
50 years,
Mm.
it is now nearing successful eradication. This demonstrates that sustained commitment, even over decades, can yield success against even the toughest plant invaders if the will is there.
Okay, that shows long-term commitment is absolutely paramount. And for aquatic species, you mentioned Callirpa, the key there seems to be acting instantly before it spreads.
That's the crucial lesson for aquatics. Striking quickly and decisively after detection is paramount because of their potential for rapid dispersion via currents or boats. The successful eradications of Callirpa in California and also the Caribbean black-striped mussel in northern Australia both succeeded primarily because they were discovered very quickly.
And the response was immediate.
And authorities acted decisively before the invader could spread beyond the original somewhat enclosed site, a lagoon or a marina. Containment was possible.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this success. The paper outlines 5 critical prerequisites for a successful eradication campaign. What are they?
Right. First, you need an explicitly identified goal. Be crystal clear. Is the goal eradication or is it restoration? If restoration is the ultimate goal, you need a plan for the subsequent steps after the invader is gone.
Got it. Goal clarity. What's second?
Second, guaranteed resources through completion. This is critical. Campaigns often fail right at the end, when the last, most costly steps eliminating those final few hard-to-find individuals are underfunded.
You absolutely cannot run out of steam when you're 99% of the way there. The last 1% is the hardest.
Exactly. Third, you need the authority to compel cooperation. Since eradication is usually an all-or-nothing effort, you need the legal authority to enforce things like mandatory access to private land for monitoring or treatment. That could be politically very challenging.
Landowner rights versus public good. Tricky.
Fourth, you must intimately understand the target species' life history to identify a unique vulnerability, a weak point in its reproductive cycle, its dispersal mechanism, its behavior, something you can exploit.
Find the Achilles heel.
Basically, yes. And fifth, You need to assess the likelihood and importance of reinvasion from outside the treatment area. This helps determine whether a failure was due to insufficient initial killing effort or just a rapid return from external sources, which might require a different strategy like permanent border control.
Okay, 5 prerequisites. We've talked about all the planning, the science, the logistics. But nature often throws curveballs, right? Especially when you remove a long-established factor from an ecosystem, ecological surprises.
Oh, absolutely. This is why Simberloff suggests we add an informal sixth prerequisite. Expect ecological surprises. Assume they will happen.
Because successful eradication often leads to unintended consequences.
It frequently does. Consequences that can actually undermine the original purpose of the eradication. The most common surprise is the rapid growth, sometimes an explosion, of previously suppressed competitor populations.
Like what?
Like the classic example of house mouse populations absolutely exploding on islands after rats, their main competitors and predators, have been successfully eradicated. You solve the rat problem, you get a mouse plague.
Right. The removal of the top, or dominant invader, changes the entire competitive balance.
Exactly. And a more recent, highly publicized surprise involved the explosion of invasive European rabbits after feral cats were eradicated from Macquarie Island, down near Antarctica.
What happened there?
The rabbits, now suddenly free from predation by the cats, multiplied drastically. They stripped vast areas of the island's unique vegetation, causing massive erosion and undermining the initial conservation purpose, which was partly to protect native seabird nesting habitat.
So the cure was, in some ways, worse than the disease initially.
It created a massive secondary problem that then also had to be managed at great expense. The lesson is clear. When you remove a major invader, the ecosystem will not simply revert to its original state, especially if the invader was there a long time. You must plan for and manage the recovery phase just as intensely as the eradication effort itself.
Okay, so eradication isn't always feasible or even desirable, especially if an invader is really widespread and deeply entrenched. In those cases, we often have to settle for maintenance management, right? Keeping invasive populations at low, tolerable levels.
That's right. Sometimes it's the only realistic option.
Let's start with the most basic approach, just physically removing them. Mechanical control.
Right, mechanical and physical control. It's often incredibly labor-intensive. It relies on things like hand-pilling weeds, cutting shrubs, or sometimes using heavy machinery like backhoes or bulldozers for larger infestations.
Does it work for continuous maintenance?
It is used successfully for that purpose, yes, often relying on dedicated personnel or volunteer groups. For example, using refuge staff and volunteers to continuously control Eurasian musk sisal in nature preserves in Kentucky, or managing European beach grass to keep it at minimal levels in coastal dune systems in Northern California.
This kind of hands-on work also offers unique opportunities, doesn't it? For community engagement, education, maybe even large-scale public works projects?
It absolutely does. The prime global example of that is the South African Working for Water program, which was initiated back in 1995.
Tell me about that.
It's a massive public works effort. At its peak, it employed around 20,000 people, many from marginalized communities, specifically to clear about 800,000 hectares of dense, water-hungry invaders like mesquite and non-native acacia trees, largely through physical labor cutting and clearing.
So beyond the conservation goal, it's a powerful social program, too, focused on job creation and water security.
Exactly. It had multiple interconnected goals.
But if eradication is expensive, maintenance management, which is by definition continuous and never-ending, must be potentially financially crushing over large areas, mustn't it?
That's the primary limitation, the high cost of sustained supervised labor. While volunteer labor helps, and specific work crews like prison crews are sometimes used, securing sustained public funding over massive regions for indefinite periods is incredibly difficult politically and economically.
Even the acclaimed Working for Water program.
Even Working for Water has faced continuous critique over the years for its high operational cost relative to its measurable ecological output per dollar spent. It demonstrates the inherent financial fragility of relying solely on labor-intensive management models at very large scales.
Okay, so physical control has limits. Let's move to chemical control. Now, you mentioned earlier the legacy of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That fundamentally changed public perception, right? Leading to stricter regulation and what the paper even terms public hemophobia.
That historical context is absolutely crucial, yes. There's a deep-seated public skepticism about chemical use in the environment, and often for good reason based on past mistakes. But modern chemical control, when used judiciously and target specifically, is often still necessary, sometimes the only viable option in the short term.
Are there modern successes where chemicals have been key?
Definitely. We've seen targeted successes like the development and use of the herbicide fluordone against the incredibly aggressive aquatic weed Hydrilla verticillata in lakes and rivers.
Hydrilla, yeah, that clogs up everything.
Completely takes over waterways. Or consider the insecticide fipronil. It was carefully deployed against the devastating yellow crazy ant on Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. That intervention led to a partial but crucial recovery of the endemic red land crabs, which were being wiped out by the ants.
So targeted application made a difference?
Yes, even specific fish poisons, pesticides like rotenone, are still carefully used in targeted ways to control invasive fish species, like the Asian topmouth gudgeon in contained water bodies.
Okay, but what are the main obstacles to relying heavily on chemicals for long-term solutions beyond just public concern about safety?
We face two major, almost generic problems that really limit chemical efficacy in the long term. First, and probably most significantly,
If
resistance.
some bugs fight back.
The bugs in the weeds fight back, exactly. Target species frequently evolve resistance to chemicals that are used repeatedly. We now see fluoridone-resistant hydrilla biotypes spreading in Florida, rendering the main chemical tool less effective.
And insects.
Insects are notorious for it. The diamondback moth, a global crop pest, has evolved documented resistance to literally every single class of chemical insecticide used against it, plus even the biological insecticide, beet toxin. This resistance forces managers into a costly arms race, using higher doses, rotating chemicals constantly.
Which just increases cost and environmental load.
Right. And the second major problem relates back to funding and economics.
Expense again.
Expense. Chemicals are developed and produced by private companies driven by profit. They primarily target large, lucrative agricultural markets where farmers can recoup the cost through crop sales.
But for environmental conservation.
For environmental conservation purposes, controlling weeds in a national park, say there's usually no market product to offset those costs. So large-scale chemical management becomes prohibitively expensive for government agencies or conservation groups operating on tight budgets.
So summing up chemicals.
Due to these issues of resistance, cost, and also lingering concerns about unknown long-term non-target impacts, chemical control's primary long-term role should probably be seen as temporary, acting as a necessary bulwark against immediate, irrevocable change like the crazy ants threatening the crabs, while we seek cheaper, more sustainable, ideally self-sustaining solutions.
And the ideal self-sustaining solution, the holy grail, has always been biological control, right?
Biocontrol, yeah. Introducing a natural enemy, a self-sustaining agent, to attack only the target invader is the conservation ideal. Ideally, it works forever with no further cost or intervention.
But historically, as you alluded to, it's had some huge, really regrettable failures. Big black eyes for the field.
Oh, absolutely. It's a sobering statistic Simberloff cites. 7 of the world's 100 worst invasive species were originally introduced deliberately for biological control.
Can you give example? I think people know the cane toad.
The cane toad in Australia is the classic cautionary tale, yes. Introduced to control cane beetles, became a much worse problem itself. Or the rosy wolf snail, introduced to Hawaii and other Pacific islands to control another introduced snail, the giant African snail, but instead it wiped out scores of unique endemic native snail species.
So what went wrong in those cases? Why were they such disasters?
They were often generalized predators. They weren't specific enough to the target pest. They just ate whatever was available and vulnerable, often the slow-moving native species that hadn't evolved defenses against such predators. Particularly vertebrates, like the toad or the mongoose, often proved disastrously generalist.
Okay, so how has modern practice evolved to avoid repeating those mistakes?
Modern practice has evolved significantly. Today's biocontrol protocols involve incredibly stringent host specificity testing before anything is approved for release. And there's a conscious, almost universal effort now to avoid using generalized predators, particularly vertebrates, for biocontrol.
How does that stringent testing work, especially for something like controlling an invasive plant?
For invasive plants, there's a widely adopted procedure called the centrifugal phylogeny method. It's quite logical.
Okay.
This method dictates that researchers must first test the potential control agent, usually an insect or a pathogen, against the plant species most closely related, evolutionarily, to the target invasive weed.
Start with the closest relatives.
Right. If the agent proves safe for those close native relatives, then they move outwards on the evolutionary tree, testing progressively more distantly related native species within the same family, then order, and so on. The idea is to rigorously assess the risk to plants that are most likely to be susceptible.
That sounds thorough. Does it work perfectly?
It significantly minimizes the risk of major non-target impacts on plants, yes. It's considered quite robust. Unfortunately, robust host testing protocols for controlling invasive insects using other insects or pathogens remain more challenging and often subject to less public and scientific scrutiny regarding potential non-target impacts on native insects.
That's a worrying gap. And there's also the risk, isn't there, that even a good agent, one that's specific, can spread outside its intended operational area and potentially become an invasive problem itself elsewhere.
Yes, that's a significant emerging risk. Autonomously spreading agents. The prime example is the cactus moth, Cactoblastis cactorum.
What's the story there?
It was famously successful controlling invasive Opuntia cacti in Australia. But then it was introduced to the Lesser Antilles in the Caribbean for similar control purposes. From there, it has spread naturally, island hopping northward, and is now established in Florida,
And threatening native cacti.
and posing a major threat to native Opuntia cacti in the southwestern U.S. and potentially Mexico, where these cacti are ecologically and culturally vital. It highlights a critical point.
Which is,
The conclusion is that biocontrol remains a crucial and potentially very economical tool in the toolbox, but because it is essentially irrevocable, you can't just recall a self-replicating species once it's out there. It requires extreme caution, rigorous science, and increasingly international cooperation and foresight.
right, you have to think beyond your own borders. This brings us to maybe the most exciting area, the real cutting edge, novel approaches. Ideas that often come from entirely unrelated fields, promising breakthroughs beyond these traditional methods.
This is where we see some really fascinating innovation happening,
Yeah.
often borrowing ideas from medicine, engineering, genetics. Take the zebra mussel, for example, notorious for clogging water intake pipes and very hard to kill because it just closes its valves tightly when it detects toxins in the water.
Right, clams up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So researchers, often from chemical engineering backgrounds, developed something called biobullets.
Biobullets. Sounds intriguing.
They're tiny beads of potassium chloride, which is toxic to mussels, coated in a specific type of fatty substance. The coating tricks the mussel. It thinks the bead is food, so it ingests it.
It bypasses the valve closing defense.
Completely bypasses the defense. Once ingested, the coating dissolves, liberating the poison internally and killing the mussel. Very clever. It's now used operationally in some water treatment facilities.
That's truly ingenious. What about pests that are maybe harder to isolate or trick like that? Like the invasive sea lamprey in the Great Lakes. They've been a huge problem for fisheries.
Yeah. Sea lampreys have been managed primarily with expensive chemical lampricides applied to rivers and physical barriers to stop their upstream migration, but breakthrough research focused on their biology. Specifically, the fact that adult parasitic phase lampreys migrate upstream from the lakes, but only return to streams where lamprey larvae are already present.
They follow the scent of their young.
Essentially, yes. Researchers discovered that the larval lampreys must be emitting a powerful, species-specific migratory pheromone that attracts the adults back to suitable spawning streams.
So they identified the chemical signal.
They identified it, concentrated it, and synthesized it. Now, management agencies are deploying this synthetic pheromone in traps. They can sewer virtually all the migrating adults in sizable water bodies into specific locations for removal,
Moving management from a broadcast chemical attack across whole rivers.
to an incredibly targeted, behaviorally based chemical lure, much more efficient and environmentally benign.
Amazing. And finally, we have the most futuristic sounding tools. The paper mentions the resurfacing of autocidal genetics, using modern molecular techniques to engineer population collapse. That sounds like sci-fi.
Well, some of these ideas were actually conceived decades ago during the push for insect control after World War II, but the genetic tools weren't available then to make them work reliably. Now, with modern molecular biology, they are becoming viable again.
What kind of methods are we talking about?
We're talking about things like the Trojan gene concept, the Daughterless carp project, and the Trojan Y chromosome method. These all involve introducing genetically modified individuals into a wild population carrying genes designed to guarantee eventual population collapse.
How does the Trojan chromosome work, for example?
In fish management, the idea is to introduce males carrying a modified Y chromosome, the male sex chromosome, that somehow ensures all their offspring are male.
Only males.
Only males. Over several generations, as these Trojan Y chromosomes spread, the population sex ratio becomes heavily skewed towards males. eventually leading to reproductive failure and demographic collapse across the entire population. No females, no future.
While some of these are being field tested now, I think I read about it with mosquitoes that transmit dengue fever. I imagine successful, predictable, long-term deployment in wild populations out in the environment is still uncertain, right? There could be unexpected consequences.
That's absolutely right. Field success and long-term ecological safety are still uncertain for many of these genetic techniques, but we should start seeing results from ongoing trials fairly soon. The important point here is that breakthroughs like this, often serendipitous byproducts of basic research in fields like endocrinology or molecular genetics, mean that previously intractable, widespread invasions, the very ones critics claimed were impossible to beat, might soon have permanent, highly targeted, and potentially cost-effective solutions. The game might be changing.
So, after reviewing the breadth of these often subtle impacts, the ticking clock of the invasion debt, and this whole suite of rapidly advancing management technologies, what is the final decisive conclusion from Simberloff's perspective on what is worth fighting?
The paper concludes pretty strongly that a major, albeit cautious effort to preclude introductions, detect them early, and fight established invasions is absolutely warranted. It's not futile.
The technological advances have moved the goalposts.
Exactly. They've made many previously hopeless cases seem potentially feasible today, which directly addresses that critique of futility. The default strategy, the paper argues, for newly detected, localized invaders should be eradication. That should be the starting point. Rejected only if there are compelling arguments proving it is physically impossible or would likely cause intolerable, scientifically proven damage to non-target native species or ecosystems.
Okay, default to eradication for new ones. But what about those long-established invaders, the species that might have been around for centuries and are now widespread and part of the landscape?
That requires much more caution, definitely, and case-by-case decisions. There are really two main factors that argue against automatically launching major management against very long-established invaders.
What are they?
One, they may have reached kind of modus vivendi, a term meaning a temporary agreement or way of life with the native community. This implies the bulk of the really damaging ecological disruption might have already occurred decades or centuries ago, and the system has reached a new, albeit altered, state of equilibrium. Trying to remove the invader now might cause more disruption than leaving it.
Okay, a new balance has been struck, potentially. What's the second factor?
Second, they may have become so deeply embedded in the local food web or habitat structure that removing them might actually damage native species that have, over time, come to rely on them.
Rely on the invader. How?
Either as a crucial food source, maybe replacing a lost native food source,
Yep.
or perhaps the invader creates physical habitat structure, like dense thickets that some native species now use for nesting or shelter. Removing the invader could harm those natives.
You used the term modus vivendi there. It's a nice term, but it implies a kind of uneasy peace, doesn't it? If you remove that established invader, you risk upsetting this new equilibrium you just mentioned.
Precisely. You risk destabilizing the new, often complex set of interactions between the remaining natives and the long-established non-native. That said, it doesn't mean established invaders should never be tackled. Sometimes removing even a deeply established invader can still yield massive ecological benefits.
Is there an example of that, fighting a really old invasion?
Yes, the example of Zimbretta Island off the coast of Tunisia is compelling. Ship rats had apparently resided there for 1,500 years. That's a very, very long established invasion.
15 centuries?
Yeah, yet they were successfully eradicated relatively recently, and this led to the dramatic recovery of a globally endangered seabird population, the Yelkouan shearwater, that nests on the island. So it proves that long tenure doesn't automatically equal permanent untouchable status if the ecological benefits of removal are high enough.
And we must also remember the social factor in all this, right? Managing these species isn't purely a biological or ecological calculus.
Absolutely correct. Long-established non-native species, even some invasive ones, may have developed human advocates over time. Perhaps due to cultural services, they provide certain introduced plants used in traditional crafts or medicine, maybe beloved garden species, or even introduced game animals. These legitimate human values and concerns must be accounted for in management decisions. It becomes a socio-ecological problem.
Okay, finally, the paper addresses those critics who sometimes suggest that introduced species might actually confer conservation benefits, especially in a rapidly changing world where native species ranges are shifting due to climate change. The novel ecosystems argument.
Right. Simberloff addresses this impartially. He notes that while some critics suggest certain non-natives might become useful novel natives or facilitate adaptation, the paper counters that in the cases actually sampled and studied rigorously, the demonstrable negative impacts of invaders usually far outweigh any claimed or speculative conservation benefits.
So maintain a cautious approach. Don't assume benefits.
Maintain a cautious, evidence-based approach, yes. And regarding that other critique, the difficulty of definitively defining native versus non-native status, which is a favorite philosophical argument of some critics.
That it's all just arbitrary human judgment.
Kind of. While acknowledging that those ambiguous cases do exist, especially with ancient introductions or hybridization, the paper points out they are greatly outnumbered by the vast majority of cases where the non-native status of a species targeted for management is unequivocally established through clear historical records or modern molecular evidence. It's not usually the core issue for management decisions.
Okay. So the overall message seems to be one of cautious optimism then. Provided we match these technological advances with genuine political commitment and guaranteed resources to see efforts through.
Absolutely. The evidence reviewed strongly suggests the problem of biological invasions is real, it's often subtle, it's growing through this mechanism of invasion debt. But the developing technology now makes victory possible in many situations where it simply wasn't before. The pessimism of the past is increasingly unwarranted.
That was a tremendous deep dive. Really fascinating. We've established that this concept of invasion debt is real and quite insidious. We learned that eradication, once widely deemed futile, is now actually a proven default strategy for early invaders, backed up by that remarkable 86% success rate in documented conservation projects.
A huge shift in perspective.
And we also saw that these novel, genetically driven management techniques, while still emerging, are incredibly promising. They potentially offer permanent, cost-effective solutions for some of the toughest, most widespread invaders.
Which brings us to a crucial point. Management success, as we noted throughout, is often hampered not by technical impossibility anymore, but by high cost and a lack of sustained political will. This leads to insufficient funding for long-term maintenance or follow-through on eradication.
Right. So if these new genetic and pheromone controls really do promise high efficacy and potentially much lower long-term maintenance costs, this raises a really important societal question, doesn't it?
Which is?
Will the societal resistance we currently see, often stemming from legitimate concerns about chemical use, the chemophobia we mentioned, simply shift its focus? Will we see new ethical debates and animal welfare questions arise surrounding genetic manipulation and release of modified organisms? Or will the sheer promise of permanent cost-saving victory finally override those concerns for some of these major environmental threats?
That's a really difficult societal balance to strike, isn't it? Especially as the tools become potentially more powerful and maybe more ethically complex. That leaves us perfectly with our provocative thought for you, the listener.
We are clearly living in a time of unprecedented global mixing of species. That's not going to stop. If we know that invasions will continue to increase due to globalization, and we know that a massive invasion debt is already boring up from species already here, how should we prioritize our limited conservation resources? Should we focus purely on traditional conservation efforts, protecting habitat, saving currently endangered native species from existing threats? Or should we perhaps invest even more heavily than we do now in the unpredictable, sometimes high-stakes research required to make these novel, potentially permanent eradication methods, like the genetic ones, truly safe, effective, and commonplace?
It's that core trade-off, isn't it? Do you focus primarily on fighting the causes, preventing new introductions, tackling them early? Or do you invest more in mitigating the effects of the ones that are already here and spreading, potentially through these powerful new technologies?
Yeah.
Where's the wisest investment for the long term?
Something to think about.